Their behaviors are the fundamental layer. You have to do the right things for anything, for sleep, for learning, for sports performance. But then there's nutrition, supplementation, prescription drugs, and then off-label stuff, right? Mm-hmm. And so we always think about, when you hear hormones in sports, you always think just the raw conversation about anabolics, all the banned stuff. We could talk about that stuff and how it works. Years ago, I used to work on androgens, testosterone and its derivatives, and how it impacts brain development and body function, fear, and also mental states. But there's a category of supplements that are very interesting that for most people who aren't exploring testosterone augmentation for sport, work very well to increase testosterone by about 100 to 200 points. Not, 300, not a tripling or anything like that. Because what happens is the testosterone molecule, it's basically carried in a cargo. So it can be in its free form, unbound form, free testosterone. And everyone says, oh, I want more free testosterone. You want more, but these what are called sex hormone binding globulins. So there's something called sex hormone binding globulin and albumin. They carry the testosterone molecule to the different tissues of the body. So you don't want all your testosterone free. You want some of it bound up so that it can be delivered to the different tissues, including your brain. But if you have too much sex hormone binding globulin, the testosterone can't really do its things, okay? So Tonga Ali, about 400 milligrams per day, has the effect of raising free testosterone and overall testosterone by about 100 to 200 points. I mean, I actually think that a lot of people who think they need TRT, when I hear about guys in their 20s and 30s, look, I'm in my mid-40s, and I can tell you that you can get and maintain very healthy testosterone levels without TRT if you do the right things, the behaviors, the nutrition, all the other stuff early on. There's sometimes people have hypogonadal syndromes and things like that. But when you look at TRT, I mean, the way that the clinics and the doctors typically do it is to give 200 milligrams and then send people out for 2 weeks, and then they come back because they can charge them to come back repeatedly. It's clear that without any TRT, the testes normally make anywhere from 7 to 15 milligrams of testosterone per day. So taking this massive dose and then waiting 2 weeks is absolutely foolish. It's amazing to me that the medical profession does this, because it doesn't match anything about the normal patterns of endocrinology. It's just not how the body works. Testosterone has the effects we're all aware of, like deepening the voice, facial hair, muscle growth, recovery, etc. Mostly because testosterone increases protein synthesis. You look at a young male in puberty, it's a protein synthesis machine. Yeah. They eat, and they just grow and grow and grow, and they're putting on muscles, and they're lean, and So most often they're lean. But in any case, testosterone has some very interesting effects on the brain. The major mental effect of testosterone is it makes effort feel good. And the reason it does it is that the amygdala, this fear center in the brain, this anxiety center in the brain, has androgen receptors. It has testosterone receptors. And so the way this works in animals and in humans as well is that for most species, the males of that species never get a chance to mate. Right? So if you think about, I'll probably pick an example where you'll know the exception, because I know you know a lot about natural animals and animals that are hunted. But if you think about animals with antlers, like rams, there's been a lot of research, believe it or not, on rams. It'd be fun. I'd love to work on it. And they have to fight for the right to mate. Yes. And the fighting is a choice, right? And the decision to walk away is a choice usually. They usually don't kill each other, although I know some of the injuries can lead to death. So testosterone, these surges in testosterone that happen seasonally in certain species like rams, or even these little hamsters, the males will rip each other's testicles off in order to fight for the right to mate. So males of a given species have to actually overcome the fear of pain and punishment. And the surge in testosterone is what causes the shift to the willingness to engage in battle. And so when humans are taking low doses or reasonable doses of testosterone, or they're increasing their testosterone, or they're going through puberty, effort and leaning into pain and challenge actually has the effect of making the body feel soothed and good. It's a drive, just like sex is a drive, or drinking water when you're thirsty is a drive. This stuff is all anchored deep within the hypothalamus. This isn't a cognitive thing. And why when people are testosterone depleted, they feel depressed, and when people have a surge of testosterone, they feel relief and anxiety, provided it's in the appropriate range. I'll just be direct about it. They were asking whether or not masturbation was bad. They were asking whether or not masturbation with ejaculation was particularly bad. And here's my stance on this. I'm a biologist and a neuroscientist, not a psychologist. But what we know for sure is that if an individual repeatedly engages in this circuitry, let's say masturbation and pornography, with increasingly potent forms of stimulation that are on a screen, a couple of things happen. First of all, what's being reinforced? What's being reinforced is a high dopaminergic response to watching other people engage in sexual behavior. Dopaminergic system is generalizable to many different behaviors, right? Academic pursuits, sports pursuits, relationship pursuits. But fundamentally, it was, again, I wasn't a consultant at the design phase, but fundamentally it's tacked into the adaptive survival behaviors. And every species, including ours, has at least two major motivations, which is to protect its young and to make more of itself, to make more young at some level. People can opt out of that, but one of the absolutely pathologic situations for any animal or human is to be able to access repeated dopamine surges without effort or any pursuit that's self-directed or that's directed, I should say. So for instance, cocaine, a drug which potently increases dopamine, or methamphetamine, which potently increases methamphetamine, but doesn't require any sort of adaptive action pursuit except to acquire the drug and spend money on it. No sacrifice. So essentially what ends up happening is the circuit that gets rewarded is only the drug-seeking behavior, and no other behavior will give the kind of potent dopamine release that cocaine or methamphetamine will, which is why they are so pernicious. Now, likewise, right. I'm not...
Well, plus they have that powerful reinforcing effect, right? So not only do you get that kick, but what's reinforced by the dopamine release is the behaviors that were right prior, particularly right prior to the ingestion. And if all that is the drug-taking behavior, that's all that develops.
That's right.
You build that monster inside your head.
That's right.
So I can see where you're going on the pornography front.
Right. So I was starting to get a lot of questions. I was kind of surprised. I thought, well, I'm male and, maybe that's why they feel comfortable asking. But people were saying, we're asking about pornography, and they were asking, I realized we want to... I'll just be direct about it. They were asking whether or not masturbation was bad. They were asking whether or not masturbation with ejaculation was particularly bad. And here's my stance on this. I'm a biologist and a neuroscientist, not a psychologist. But what we know for sure is that if an individual repeatedly engages in this circuitry, let's say masturbation and pornography, with increasingly potent forms of stimulation that are on a screen, a couple of things happen. First of all, what's being reinforced? What's being reinforced is a high dopaminergic response to watching other people engage in sexual behavior, which is very different than being in a first-person sexual experience. Okay? So right there, that what's being reinforced is not actually any kind of improvement in communication skills. It's voyeurism. And as these questions started to come in more and more, I started to realize there was a lot of kind of undertones of people talking about fear of or experience with sexual dysfunction that clearly pornography can lead to. And here I'm specifically talking about males. I actually don't know the literature on females. So here I'm talking about...
Females don't use visual pornography to the same degree.
I see.
They use literary pornography.
I see. So... So, and then you start to think about, okay, what happens in the cascade or the arc of sexual arousal and orgasm? What happens is that initially there's it's parasympathetically dominant, meaning if somebody is too stressed, they actually can't engage in sexual behavior. The arousal response doesn't occur. Erection is blunted, but the actual orgasm response and ejaculation is strongly associated with the so-called sympathetic nervous system, which has nothing to do with sympathy. It has everything to do with, it's a kind of a stress response. And then it reverses to a parasympathetic response. And a hormone called prolactin increases dramatically after ejaculation in males. What does that do? That blunts dopamine release and testosterone for a very long period of time, which makes sense if pair bonding and sort of, in our species anywhere, there's this idea that then other molecules would be exchanged with partners, pair bonding, potential for raising mates, etc. Without getting into a huge discussion about that, the point is this. Masturbation and pornography are potently tapping into the dopamine system and can undermine the very processes of what I consider healthy processes of finding a mate, dating, communication, eventually, if it's appropriate, sexual interaction, etc.
Like it's undermining pair bonding.
And pair bonding.
So here's a question. If you're seeking sexual release through pornography and you go through the whole cycle and you get a prolactin release, do you bond with yourself?
So this is very interesting. It's the biology explains it as what's left there is a kind of an open loop, a kind of an emptiness, right? Because bonding with the self is a complicated notion. I mean, there's a healthy version of that, of course, loving oneself and self-referencing. And again, this is more far more your domain than mine in terms of what a healthy self-relation is. But in the absence of a real partner there, of an absence of real sexual partner, there's an open loop of neurochemicals, including oxytocin and prolactin. The dopamine, remember, dopamine goes up during pursuit, anticipation, then peaks and then crashes below baseline after orgasm and ejaculation. So this kind of low that people fear is putting them into an amotivated state. We can think of this, if I were to kind of expand on it, would be it's this kind of neurochemical, psychological equivalent of making your home environment filthy for a while, not actually putting you into this positive amplification of dopamine. So it depletes the dopamine system. And it's likewise in drugs of abuse and addiction, it eventually depletes the dopamine system. Initially, there's a huge dopamine surge with drugs of abuse like methamphetamine and cocaine. But over time, people are using more and more to achieve what is not such a great high. You even see this a little bit with kind of consumption of energy drinks. Like people are taking more and more chemicals within their energy drinks, and they're thinking about loud, fast music, energy drinks, this kind of stacking of dopaminergic tools. Now, that's not as pathologic. In fact, there are some energy drinks I'll occasionally drink, and I enjoy them. I don't think we need to be entirely afraid of pursuing or engaging in things that release dopamine. Obviously, healthy sexual behavior, food that we love, social engagement, all of these things can be dopaminergic. It's the big peaks in dopamine that are not associated with any prior effort or organization of self that are particularly dangerous for the human being.
Yeah, well, you could see that's a cardinal danger of affluence. Then
that's right. This is why the children of
right? You know.
That's right.
You cannot get rats addicted to cocaine if they live in their natural environments.
Is that right?
You can only get rats addicted to cocaine if they're isolated rats in a cage. Yeah, they won't bar press for cocaine in a natural environment, and it's because they have alternative sources of dopaminergic gratification.
Very interesting.
So, it's very interesting.
Yeah, the children of very wealthy people who are overindulged, I've seen that many times, many times, and it is a very sad sight.
Well, they're not optimally deprived, eh? And that issue of optimal deprivation, that's a killer issue for an affluent society.
Just how triggering are our phones when it comes to dopamine?
Okay, great question. We often hear that that social media getting dopamine hit after dopamine hit. When we first get on social media for the first time or after a long period of time, the amount of dopamine that's released we think is quite substantial. It's novel. Remember, dopamine is about novelty, surprise, and the sense that we are on some exciting track. That's what dopamine is really about. It puts us into states of readiness, anticipation, looking, seeking, etc., almost always for things outside the confines of our skin. Just to contrast it maybe for a bit more of a future discussion, serotonin does the opposite. When there's a lot of serotonin in our brain and body, typically it makes us feel satisfied, sated, and more quiescent, comfortable with what we have in our own immediate sphere and within us, right? The comfort of a good meal, the food you have. Dopamine is about go, go, go. If you look at somebody who's high on cocaine or methamphetamine, it's all about pursuit, because that's a very dopaminergic drug. You look at somebody who's taken a drug, and I'm not suggesting people do this, but it really ramps up serotonin. Let's say a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, Prozac, Zoloft, etc. The side effects of those drugs, if the dosages are too high, lack of appetite, lack of libido, kind of meh about life, then so they'll adjust the dose down. That's because those are serotonergic drugs. So in general, when we are in pursuit of things, dopamine is quite high. The thing about cell phones is when you first get on there, and you haven't, let's say no Wi-Fi on the flight or something, and you land, it can actually be quite stimulating. You get a lot of dopamine. Oh, there's this. Oh, there's that. But very quickly, when you're scrolling on social media, you're no longer getting the novelty, but you're continuing to do it. And you almost don't know why you're doing it. At that point, it shifts over to something that's a bit more like an obsessive compulsive behavior, where we can define an obsessive compulsive behavior where the obsession leads to a compulsion. So the obsession is a thought, the compulsion is a behavior, but the acting out of the compulsion merely serves to increase the obsession. right? This is very different than being obsessed with food or obsessed with cleanliness.
There's no payoff.
Right, exactly. There's no anxiety relief by carrying out the compulsion. With OCD behaviors, like scrolling social media, the dopamine quickly wanes, and then you find that you're just and we've all been there, you're scrolling, you're like, why am I doing this? This isn't that interesting. This isn't that interesting. Now, the algorithms for social media are very clever, and I don't want to demonize it. I, provide a lot of my life is spent on, on social media now, but in the algorithms that they've incorporated function on the most powerful way to keep people doing a behavior, or an animal for that matter, is intermittent random reward, or random intermittent reward, that you don't know when you're going to hit the jackpot. So you're scrolling, and then you see something. Typically it's very high, what, in nerd speak, we'd say signal to noise. So if you're reading some interesting things, this came out in the news, this came out, and then it's all of a sudden a riot, or a person that is base jumping off a building, or for people that are scrolling looking at bodies or something like that, live bodies. Hopefully people aren't looking at dead bodies. But look, if something's very tragic, then that has this gravitational pull. And then what happens is you start getting the system working for that next dopamine hit that you don't know when it's going to come. It's just like gambling. So I look at social media as initially being very dopaminergic, driving reward, surprise, and excitement, but very quickly transitioning to something more like OCD, and the kinds of behaviors where it looks, if we were to look at ourselves through the lens of an experiment, like we would an animal experiment, we think that animal is sick. If you saw an animal digging in the corner, looking for a bone, the dog is looking, you'd think that's really sad. That's us. I'm not an episode early on sexual development.
Yes.
We've done them on optimizing testosterone and estrogen,
Yes.
and we touched a little bit on on libido and somewhat on sex performance, but not much. We did an episode on relationships, love, and desire, where we touched on libido specifically. So just as a quick mention of something, a lot of people take SSRIs, or antidepressants, that can disrupt sexual function. There are a few compounds like maca root and tonga ali and things like that, that at least in a few studies in humans have been shown to offset some of the sexual side effects. Now, in terms of sexual, and then the episode on sexual development was about how the brain and body become organized in certain ways, how the brain becomes organized if you have X chromosomes or Y chromosomes, or etc.
You were talking earlier on about the fact that dopamine can be released when you set yourself a little goal and then achieve it. And one of the ways that you encourage your grad students is to give them a little bit of reward earlier on so that it keeps them motivated. Is this the same mentality that works during an endurance event when you want to say, I'm just got to get myself to the next lamppost, I've just got to get myself to that hill over there? Is that the same dynamic?
Yeah, we can call it milestoning. You just set some milestone. And the key thing here is that, and this is the beauty of the dopamine system, just like the stress system is generic, the fear system is generic. It's designed for a bunch of different scenarios. The motivation system is also generic. It can be to achieve the next lamppost as a milestone, or it can be 5 miles as the next milestone. You get to control that. There is this thing about, there's a lot on the internet about semen retention and chi, right?
Yeah.
After orgasm, here we're talking about males and females, but in males, after ejaculation, there's an increase in the hormone prolactin, which makes you very mellow. And that sets the refractory period. And during that time, you're not getting another erection, you're not having sex again. Mm-hmm. This is why drugs that increase dopamine sometimes are kind of pro-sexual drugs. Mm-hmm. But if people take too much of them, then they're just like all gas pedal, but they're not relaxed enough to actually get an erection, mm-hmm. right? This is the cocaine thing, right? So, sex is a dance between arousal and relaxation. Right. Tantra understands that, and they try and bring people into kind of a mellow plane where they are controlling all that rise and fall of arousal over and over again. That's the idea.
What about sexual fantasy? To get Freudian for a second, what role does sexual fantasy have in the human condition?
Well, here's the uncomfortable reality. Freud was at least right about one thing, which is that the brain circuitry that you used to develop attachments to your caregivers, mother and father or other caregivers, do not disappear when you hit puberty. They are repurposed for romantic and sexual relations. And so this is why the whole notion of anxious attached and secure attached, stems from childhood attachment patterns, but it carries over to romantic relationships. to have an awareness where if you sense too much excitement in yourself or too much anticipation of how great someone is, I'm not saying don't fall in love, but be very cautious about the extremes of dopamine. Be very wary about the thing that makes you feel incredible. And I say this with some trepidation because I myself, love love, right? I love love.
I love love.
But I love falling in love. It's the best. Love falling in love, love being in love. I mean, that's true in romantic relationships. And I also, I love having a bulldog. Like I love Tim. Love. I have so many loves in life and relationships that are always the best of it, right? But there is this element where it is a bit of a drug, right? It's this thing because it's always about more. And if you really want the relationship, if you want good clarity on the relationship and you want it to last, there has to be a tempering of that. And I don't mean playing aloof. I don't mean canceling things last minute. I don't mean playing any kind of games with the dopamine reward prediction error thing.
Is it possible to both be so excited and connected that you feel that huge drive and push to like mate and be together and spend time? Or is that overly heightened dopamine or state an indication of an unhealthy loop or pattern relationship in two people?
Oh, I think it can be healthy. I mean, and also remember, dopamine is a generic molecule. So for instance, if ever there was a justification for maintaining a lot of different interests and things that can generate dopamine, here's one. We talked about before, when you're in a relationship that's really great, you feel more energy to do other things. Dopamine being the substrate by which adrenaline is created, et cetera. Well, the opposite is also true. You imagine the couple and one is doing kind of well in life. They're excited about life. The other one is not. Well, the person who's excited about life is sort of like, is in a position to be more excited about the relationship. If you come home from a great day at work, 3 minutes, just 3 minutes in trying to intensely learn this thing, even if I feel like I'm failing, but belief systems have a powerful role in how the tools and practices that we engage in shape us.
How can people think about the best way they can learn?
Terrific question. And fortunately, nowadays, we can look to studies done in humans that define some very key principles. The first principle is that the whole process of neuroplasticity and learning is really a two-stage process. First, there must be focus. Turns out that from beautiful work done by my colleague at Stanford School of Medicine, Eric Knudsen, has shown that yes, it's true that early in development, in humans, this would be up until the mid-20s, we can learn things in larger batches and much more easily than we can later in life. However, if one batches that work into smaller increments, and for instance, deciding, maybe set a timer, turning the phone off otherwise, and saying, I'm going to spend 3 minutes, just 3 minutes in trying to intensely learn this thing, even if I feel like I'm failing. If some people do really well on low carbohydrate, meat-rich diets because they're just not as bloated, they're not carrying as much water and other stuff. Carbohydrate carries a lot of water molecules with it. So there are aspects to being able to train and being really explosive because you feel light. One anecdote that really, again, I'm not encouraging any one particular kind of diet, but I have a friend who was in the SEAL teams. I happen to know a number of people in that community, and he told me that he did this very long fast. It was a fast that I think you get to eat a little bit of soup or broth, and there's like a bar or something, but it's like a 9-day thing. And he's a very strong athlete, and he said that on day 6 or 7, he was running up some hills or something while he was on deployment, and he felt amazing. He had kind of hit this other level. He was somebody who had boxed in the Naval Academy. He was somebody who knows and knew high output. And he felt like he discovered the 13th floor, that there was another floor to this performance space that he hadn't experienced except while he had fasted. And he said that that was a remarkable clarity of mind, energy. It's a little bit of what you described. He described a kind of suppleness and explosiveness. So there's probably something there.
On which day?
At once he was in the 5th or 6th day of the fast.
See, this is the thing, is I've never been there on the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th day, that kind of thing. But when I just don't eat for 20 hours, many times through my training, the clarity, it's like you feel like everyone is moving super slowly, and you're able to like dominate people you weren't able to before. It's like,
well, you might have slipped into or switched over rather into full ketosis.